إن أردتم أن تكونوا شامة بين الورى فاقتفوا آثار جيل للمعالي سطرا. إن أردتم أن تكونوا شامة بين الورى فاقتفوا آثار.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, and hello, and welcome to today's talk. On behalf of the Pakistani Society and Islamic Society, we would first of all like to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Shaheen Sardar. We are honoured and privileged to have her here with us. Despite her very busy schedule, she has kindly accepted our invitation to come here and to share her views and experiences with us. She is a distinguished Islamic law and human rights scholar. She is currently the Professor of Law at the University of Warwick. She is also the Vice Chair of the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. She served as the first female cabinet minister for health, welfare and women's development in the government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan, also known as NWFP. She also served as the first chair of the National Commission on the Status of Women of Pakistan. She is the recipient of a number of highly distinguished awards, including the highest presidential award in Pakistan for her contribution to higher education and research. She has written a number of books and published extensively in renowned journals on the issue of women's rights, Islamic law and human rights. She is the author of Gender and Human Rights in Islam and International Law, Equal Before Allah and Equal Before Man. She is also the co-author of Human Rights, Plural Legalities and Gendered Realities, Parts Are Made by Walking. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Shaheen Sardar.
Good evening, everybody. Hello and Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to look at you people who are leaders of the future, and for people like myself to be able to share my thoughts and experiences with you. Now, as Ayman has mentioned, just a tiny bit about the very long journey that people like myself have had to go through to reach a position where I can actually stand before people like yourself and share my views. I was born in a very small village in the northwestern mountains of Pakistan, and it is a beautiful part of the world known as Switzerland of the East. Unfortunately now it's more infamous than famous because of the war and conflict that took place 3 years ago. But if you can imagine that, I was born and raised in that part of the world, but my grandfather, who was head of the household, as well as my grandmother, they both had this ambition for all their grandchildren, without difference as to grandsons or granddaughters. And they used to say, well, people vie over property and land and that sort of thing, having more wealth. But what I would really like to vie for is to have the most educated, literate, progressive, enlightened children and grandchildren in the world. That was their ambition. Now I know the moment I say this, for a lot of you, it's like banging straight into stereotypes that you will have heard about that part of the world. But that's the reality, and that's what gave us the courage and the confidence to come forward into the world, where in a country where in some parts the female literacy is as low as 5%. So if you can imagine that that's where I started my journey and have reached here before you. So what I would like to do today is to share with you my understandings of women's rights in Islam. And I do this, although I do this from a very rigorous and robust academic perspective and viewpoint, but I do this as a Muslim woman. So my perspectives are from within my faith, and so I argue for women's rights in Islam from within Islam and make the linkages with human rights instruments, be they from the United Nations, be they regional instruments, or wherever. But my reference point is as an insider from within the tradition. Now, just so we're all on the same wavelength, I just thought I would just quickly take you through the main sources of Islamic law and human rights. So where do we draw inspiration, information, and authority to construct this edifice that we call human rights in general, but women's human rights in particular? And for this, we draw upon the Quran, which Muslims believe to be the word of Allah, the word of God, which was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And each and every word of that Quran is believed to be guidance not only in the moral, ethical, sociological, or political sense, but there are a number of very clear and distinct verses in the Quran that form the basis of lawmaking. So one can actually extrapolate legal formulations from those verses of the Quran. So that's the primary source. The second source, again a primary source, is the words and deeds and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and these were actually confined to literature many decades after he passed away. So initially it was an oral legal tradition. It was handing down of what people had seen or heard, and it was passed on intergenerationally. But of course, with the arrival of paper and printing presses and written materials, very early on then, an entire science of how do you sift the authoritative sunnah from the ones that are not as authoritative from a legal perspective. So if, as a student of law, I want to try and find out what are my rights in Islam, where will I go? I'll go to the Quran, I will go to the Sunnah. But then, everything's got to be contextual and everything has got to be relevant and contemporary and responsive to all ages as the centuries have moved forward. And of course, as the centuries move forward, situations differ and new situations emerge. So how do we actually deal with that? And for this, we have a number of what I would call secondary sources in Islam. One is ijma, and the root of that is jama, is collectivity. So it's actually a collective decision on a particular question of law or rights or whatever that is thrown up, and which the jurists would actually have to thrash out and arrive at a decision in the light of the primary sources. Now that's a collective exercise. And so, just a short detraction here from the main issue, but for me, this is where I find authority within Islam and Islamic law for the institution of democracy. Because if it's to be consensual, if a whole range of qualified people have to sit and thrash out an issue, then it means that dictatorial regimes, monarchies, or somebody just standing up and saying, this is the law, it means that's not what Islam is all about. So it is consensual, it is democratic, it is egalitarian. And it gives a lot of support to human reason and intellect, because it's really the intellect of the humans that is then generating and formulating these rules and formulation of rights. And finally then there's an individual source. I call it individual, which means an individual jurist can actually apply that, and that is called qiyas, which means analogy. So you try, and the best example that I can find of analogy, which I always tell my students, is this. At the time when Islam was promulgated, I don't think we had cocaine or hash or heroin or whiskey or vodka, I mean, I'm assuming. So, how do we formulate the laws that prohibit alcohol and these kind of intoxicating substances in the 21st century? For this, what you do have in the Quran is a very clear statement that says, do not go near anything that clouds the senses and the intellect. Khamar. So it clouds your senses, and grapevine and date wine, and even wheat wine, whatever that meant, were the contemporary formulations 14 centuries ago. And you can then extrapolate into the 21st century, and that's how you actually make law. So what I'm trying to say in a nutshell is that whilst on the one hand, the words and the concepts may not completely be ones that we use today when we talk about rights, the underpinning norms are the same. Human dignity, human worth, human value, and basic rights. So that's where I find my inspiration from. And for instance, there are two words that come again and again in the Quran. One is haqq and one is fard. So haqq very clearly translates as rights, and fard translates as duty or obligation. So you have, in the very, very sort of basic sense, you have a notion and a structure of rights and duties and reciprocity. Yeah? Now, having laid this kind of a general, and I have to say very general, basic framework, we come to human rights for women in Islam. And as a Muslim woman, I've spent at least 40 years of my life researching and reading and rereading and trying to articulate and understand what women's human rights in Islam are about. And what I saw and felt and observed was that there were a number of sort of background scenarios or context, for want of a better term, that actually inform the interpretation of what rights women on the ground actually manage to get in Islamic societies. And I'll share that with you. The first thing that I found out was that we've got to distinguish between Islam and Muslims. Islam is a framework of life, including laws, including rights. But the individual act of a Muslim is not necessarily Islamic. And that's a very, very major distinction that I was hit with for as long as I can remember. Because I thought to myself, one of the basic things I've been taught from the Quran is that everybody has got to be educated. Because the first revelation that Muslims believe came in the Quran was Iqra, which means read. And not read literally as in read, acquire knowledge. Now this was the most basic right that every man and woman and child has in Islam. The right to be educated. Yet, many Muslims deny that to men and women both. So that's the reason why I'm saying please try and use this as a background information when you're trying to understand the subject I'm talking about today. The distinction to be drawn between Islam and between Muslim. The two don't necessarily match, just like Christianity and Christians don't necessarily, or Hinduism or Because we are all human beings who are responsible for their individual actions. But that's not to say that that action is being dictated word for word by a religion or by an ideology or whatever. As human beings, we've got to be responsible for our own actions. So that's one thing I'd like you to bear in mind. The second thing I'd like you to bear in mind is the plurality and interpretative space that is available in all religious texts. So whether it's the Bible, the Old Testament or the New Testament, whether it's the Quran, whether it's the Veds, whichever text you look at, it's got, why it is that it's so interpretatively plural, because of the fact that it's got to have an audience that is universal and that is forever. So you can't be overly specific, because then you might become irrelevant. Or you might not have an all-encompassing vision. People who read it may think, oh, that doesn't really apply to me. And so the Quran, as a text which Muslims believe to be the divine word, is no different. Now, I believe that this interpretative plurality has become a double-edged sword when we're trying to understand women's human rights in Islam, or indeed the concept of human rights or accountability or good governance or just about everything. Because whatever is said in general terms, there is an element that one can actually construct it or construe it slightly differently. And so there may be one or more interpretations of the same situation. And here, I'll give you an example. Very simple example. The laws of inheritance in Islam, the same verses of the Quran being read by those belonging to the Sunni sect of Islam and those read by the Shia sect of Islam. But there's a lot of context and history that comes into play when you're trying to formulate it. So within the Sunni school of thought, if a man dies leaving only, say, 2 girls or 3 girls, daughters, yeah, and no male issue, the Sunni interpretation would be 2/3 of it is divided among the daughters, the remaining goes to the nearest male agnate. Okay? That very same verse of the Quran is interpreted by the Shia school of thought to mean that basically it's applicable, it's divided among the daughters, because they are the offspring of the deceased. Now here there is an ideological history that a lot of people in the room will be familiar with, some will not. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ only was survived by female children. His male offspring died in infancy. Yeah? And the Shia school of juristic thought in Islam is very much tied to that notion that the daughters of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ were in truth his heirs. Yeah? And so when the jurists in the Shia school of thought were trying to interpret, that was the interpretation that they came up with, whereas in the Sunni school of thought, there was a context of tribal Arabia that crept in. Yeah? So this is a quick example about how interpretative plurality affects most of all women's human rights. Another quick example. If you look at chapter 4 of the Quran and you start at verse 3, the context here is there was a battle known as the Battle of Uhud, in which all the able-bodied Muslim men went into battle, and this was the battle where the Muslim army lost, and lost dozens of its able-bodied men. Now this is 7th century Arabia, very much public-private dichotomy, women remaining in the private sphere, men, climbing up the date palms, picking the palms, taking the cattle out to the desert, etc., etc. And with one blow, you have most families left with widows and orphans. Yeah? And so here you have dozens and dozens of widows and orphans coming there and saying, how are we going to exist now? Our day-to-day existence was obviously dependent on the men in our family. Now, the first time round, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, there was a general injunction to all the Muslims to say, look after your neighbors, look after these orphans, look after these children. Their men have been martyred in battle for Islam, you've got to support them. And after a while, as it happens, you try and help out and then you get on with your lives and things, those people are left to get on with their lives. So again, these women go to the Prophet and say, what do we do now? We're really in trouble. And this Quranic verse on polygamy, which I call the Polygamy Verse, which starts at verse 3 in chapter 4 of the Quran, it actually starts by saying that if you are able to look after the orphans and widows, and of these, if you are able to marry 2, 3, or 4, however, only if you can deal with them justly, and if you cannot, one is the best for you. This is a very sort of rough translation of chapter 4, verse 3 to verse 7 of the Quran. This is what I call the main polygamy verse. And then verse 129 of the same chapter, a few verses down, says, it is impossible for you to do justice between women. Okay? Now, as somebody who's a student of Islamic law and a student of women's human rights in Islam, I find that these verses of the Quran are not a straightforward permission, a blanket permission, or a blank check to be polygamous. There are a number of prerequisites that have to be fulfilled. And if those prerequisites cannot be fulfilled, what do you do? So it's a combination here of legal formulation, religious formulation, moral formulation, ethical formulation, and most of all, contextual. You've got to put it into context. Yeah? Now, one thing that I always used to struggle with, and I'm sure that many people in the room will have struggled with this as well, and I'll probably continue to struggle. We know that we have about 6,666 verses in the Quran. Yeah? And of those, 6,660 are completely gender neutral and non-discriminatory. And I just hope and request you to accept that, because after 38 years, I wouldn't tell you anything but what my experience was. What I did find were 6 verses that actually did create gender inequality within Islam. Yeah? So men and women did not have completely equal rights as you and I understand it today. However, they are all contextual and they're all susceptible to more than one interpretation. But the interpretation which is less women friendly is the one that seeped through the centuries, because the vehicle of transportation was the male. Was the male jurist, was the male advocate, was the male head of the family, was the male head of the tribe, was the male head of government, etc., etc. So if the experiences, because I don't think that one fine morning, all the men in the world got into a huddle and said, do you know what, we've got to be discriminatory to these women. Can't believe that. No. We all work together, we've all got fantastic relationships in many shapes and forms. That's not how things develop. Things developed as a response to situations, to societal norms, to, men going out and being the hunter and the gatherer of food, and women, because of biological compulsions, were doing the childbearing and child rearing. But that doesn't mean that one is less than the other or the other is less than the first. But slowly and gradually, what did that transform into? It transformed into the value of work being hierarchical, and the one in the public sphere being more visible, being more quantifiable, because it was bringing in the cash. Yeah? So that got a higher quality, higher value on it, and women's work was less visible, less quantifiable, and therefore over the centuries gradually this hierarchy of men and women's work actually developed. My husband always tells me that he is the person who's always targeted because of my research on women's human rights in Islam. And I'll tell you why. Because I try and dig out the most strong women-friendly verses in the Quran and flag it at him and say, you know what? This is what Islam says. So one morning, I think I needed some money or something. And I said to him, do you know what? I have read this hadith, this part of the sunnah. I have read that a woman can never be accused of stealing from her husband because everything that the husband has is hers. But the reverse is not true in Islam. And he went like, oh my God, where did that come from? But that is true. That's absolutely true. In Islam, as a basic right, marriage in Islam is a contract between two equal adult consenting individuals. Yeah? So, I'm not supposed to do the housework. I can do it if I'm nice, if I want to. And if I'm not able to or I don't want to, then I'm sorry, it's not part of my contract. So, whatever money comes through the door, then by virtue of that little bit of translation, is mine, isn't it? Because he's able to go out and work and get the money because I'm able to look after the children and I'm able to do the work. So in Islamic law, yes, some feminists have told me it's a double-edged sword. It is a double-edged sword, but one has to try and then understand and make those choices. So for example, in Islamic law, in the contract of marriage, a woman can stipulate what she wants from the marriage. A woman can actually put down, agree a mahar, which is translated as dower in English, not a very satisfactory translation, but meher means a sum of money or other property, which is negotiated as part of the stipulation of a Muslim marriage. And, traditionally, it could be, it's anything and everything. It's like a contract, yeah? You go and you say, fine, how much, and this is supposed to be a mark of respect and dignity for the wife, because historically we know that most of the wealth in this world belongs to men. So, under Islamic law, Islam wanted to provide woman with that kickstart into getting into a new life. She needed some economic strength and empowerment of her own. Yeah? Now I'll give you an example of how this has been twisted not to allow a Muslim woman to actually assert that empowerment. In my community, we're a bit mad. We just definitely skip the man alive and say, you know what, this house, that land, this, that, this money, this is the mahar. Yeah? So that's it. So the mahar is yours. Now, some communities said, actually, now think of this, 1400 years ago, what did Bibi Fatima Zahra, radiallahu anha, who was the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, when she was marrying his cousin, Ali bin Abi Talib, what was the mahar? Nitpicking. So 14 centuries ago, how much was a pound? How much was a shilling? How much was a pence worth? Do you see what I'm getting at? How much was a coin of gold? By my reckoning, it's about 35 pence today. And they say, do you know what? That is the Sunnah mahar. If the Prophet's daughter got this amount as her mahar, my God, far be it from us to ask for anything more. Without doing a bit of maths, they need to go to the city to get some mathematician or financial advisor to multiply it by 1400 years plus what that meant that day. Now, if people step back and say, do you know what? But that's Islam's fault. I'm sorry, it's not Islam's fault. It's our fault. It's the fault of the patriarchal mindset in society that refuses to put a women-friendly interpretation on that law. So, for example, someone like me, my husband gave me a house. And I'm very happy about it. I mean, why should I be apologetic about it? Now, my professor was going, this was way back in Pakistan. So my professor was going to Hajj, the pilgrimage in Mecca. And when you're going to the pilgrimage, one of the basic things you've got to do is to pay off your debts. Because someone in debt, someone having that burden of debt hanging over your shoulders, you're not meant to go for the pilgrimage. So one debt that they had was her mahar, which her husband hadn't paid, bless him. So she took me into a corner, and I mean, I must have been in my mid-20s or something, because I mean, I just immediately got into work when I graduated. So she said, you know what, I went to the village yesterday, and these women, all the older women, took me into a room and said, do you know the rule that you should be free of debt and burdens when you're going to the pilgrimage? And you know that your husband hasn't paid you the dower. Now, can you imagine your husband going to the pilgrimage with that burden on his shoulders? So she looked at me like that and she said, so what do you think I should do? And I said, well, I think it's very simple. He should get rid of his burden. And she said, what does that mean? Because the women told me to relinquish it, to give it up. And I said, no, there's another way of getting rid of the burden. Get him to pay it to you. Now, see, this seems fairly simple, but this also tells you how you can meander through these interpretative pluralities that actually end up making it appear as if Islam doesn't give rights to women, when in actual fact, it is the Muslims who do not want to interpret it in a manner. Some Muslims, not me, I get the best out of it, but it's basically a very easy interpretation, isn't it? By saying, oh, this poor man, you know what, give him the mahar back. Yeah, but there's another way of doing it. Give the mahar to the wife and get on with it. So that's, now in the framework, this is the most contested and controversial area of women's human rights in Islam. And the reason is because, as I've shown you with these few examples, how difficult it is to negotiate it in an atmosphere, in a society, in an environment that does not allow the women-friendly positive aspects of Islamic law to be portrayed. The final point I will say on this, and I think I better leave some room for our discussion. The final example I will give you is that of dissolution of marriage. Yeah. So a lot of people ask me, and my students ask me, oh, in Islam actually it's only the man who can end the marriage. And I said, there's nothing can be further from the truth than this. Because can you imagine, if marriage is a contract, then its dissolution is the breaking up of the contract. And if there are two parties that form the contract, then obviously it's two parties who break it up. So how can you have one and not the other? having the right to enter the marriage as well as to exit it. And this actually is one of the most problematic situations that have arisen in the United Kingdom, for instance, among the British communities, British Muslim communities. Because in Pakistan, in other parts of the Muslim world, it's fairly obvious that if the man wants to break up the marriage, he will exercise what is called talaq. Yeah? He will end the marriage. If the wife wishes to dissolve the marriage, she will go for what is called khul, which means giving up her something in return, normally her mahar, negotiating that she is released from the marriage tie. Or you can have a dissolution of marriage by mutual consent. Yeah? Now, in Islam, the territorial boundaries are obviously in the West and everywhere in the world are only a post-Westphalian phenomena. So it's only what, 300 odd years that this world has actually had states and governments. That wasn't how it was. Now, Islam doesn't perceive, for Muslims I think, it's one of the easiest things to do to become part of a global citizenship. Because in Islam, the whole world belongs to Allah, and so long as you behave yourself, you can be anywhere in the world and be law-abiding citizens. So it's no big deal really. Muslims can ease in and out without necessarily having particular loyalties tied down to any particular place. Now on the talaq issue, unfortunately, in Britain, in many communities, rather than following the law of Islam, which says that you are to be law-abiding citizens and follow the law of the country in which you are, provided, of course, it prevents you from your 5 main pillars of Islam. And you've got to acknowledge and engage with all its institutions, whether it's the court, whether it's, any part of the state. Which actually also means divorce, which also actually means marriage. Yet, a lot of British Muslims will not register their marriages civilly. Now, I have been reading a number of opinions from religious scholars around the world. They're called fatwas in Arabic, which says that Islam doesn't want you to hide underground with your relationships. Islam wants these to be in the public domain. So why are you hiding away in the private sphere? Come out and as equal citizens, register those marriages. Likewise, for divorce, similarly, engage with the courts and follow and accept the decisions of the courts. Now, these are completely Islamic law notions that impinge on the rights of not only women, but men and women and children and entire communities. And I think that I'm going to close with that, with a plea, because I see a lot of young men and women in the room who can take this message forward, to say that as Muslim, parts of Muslim communities, that is but one of our multiple identities. We're British, we're Muslim, we're men, we're women, we're from Sheffield, we're from Warwick, we're from wherever. But what binds us together is our common humanity and our common interest to live happily amongst each other. And Islam is the last, I would have thought, to my understanding, is the last to tell us to do otherwise. Islam requires us to engage with all human beings, because that's what Islam and Salam means: peace and tranquility and cohesion. And that's where I would say that I draw my inspiration from, whether it's for human rights, for men or for women. Thank you.
Right, we'll have the question and answer session right now. So we have Ayman and Radia, and they will approach you. You should raise your hand.
Any questions, please do raise your hands. Yeah.
Can you say something about inheritance laws?
About the inheritance laws. Yeah. Well, the inheritance laws, again, I think I briefly touched upon it. We look at inheritance laws in a holistic manner. Yeah? So, in tribal Arabia, there was a system where it wasn't just your nuclear family, but your extended family that you were responsible for. Yeah? And every verse of the Quran that actually gives the male an advantage over the woman is precluded by economic responsibility and superiority. So that's the backdrop one has got to be aware of. At a general level, one part, for every one part that a male heir gets, for a woman, the man gets double that share. And the rationale for that is economic responsibility. Now, I have actually looked at verse 434 of the Quran, which people think is a blanket cover for male superiority. But if you read the flow of the Arabic, even by a very simple non-native Arab speaker like myself, I can tell that it is precluded by economic superiority. It says, because the male uses his resources and applies them to look after the females or the women and the household, therefore he has an enhanced position. So if you look at the reverse, what if it is the woman who is actually the only income earner? Not because the man's a do-gooder, he can be disabled, he can have had an accident, he may have just died, leaving her with 3 or 4 children. Who then is going to look after them? So on inheritance, that is the general principle is 2:1. But it doesn't have to be 2:1, because if you look at the mahar, like I said to you, my husband has given a big chunk of his property to me as mahar, but that mahar is not included in the inheritance. Do you see what I mean? I get that over and above my inheritance. Number 2. Number 3, there is an institution in Islamic law called hiba, which means gift. And so gift, a person can actually give that gift. So why I'm giving you all these various aspects is to see that we've got to look at it contextually. But if you want to ask me in a nutshell, yes, that is one of those 6 verses that I was referring to, where man and woman do not get an equal share.
Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned something about divorce. What happens if one or both partners are cheating? Like, what does that count as? Would the woman be getting divorced or the man?
What if one? See, you've got to be specific.
Okay,
I'm wearing my lawyer hat on. You're saying there's a man and a woman who are married. Yeah, and then?
Let's say one of them cheats on
Well,
the
who?
wife. Okay, let's say the man cheats on the wife.
Yeah, and that obviously, as far as Islamic law is concerned, it is a ground for divorce. But insofar as the man himself is concerned, because under Islamic law, a Muslim woman does not have to live in a relationship where any kind of immoral activities are taking place. This is a ground for divorce in Islamic law.
Another question, what would happen if there's children?
You mean custody and guardianship?
Yeah.
Well, in Islam, the best interest of the child, which is actually incidentally what the UN Convention on Rights of the Child says 14 centuries later, but that is the binding principle. Yeah? The best interest of the child. Now, having said that, look at it in that overarching framework. There are some rules there where the custody, the mother is the first point that the court has to relinquish custody to. Yeah? And guardianship, which means walaya in the Arabic, which is the overarching decisions in terms of, that is something which they have to take together. But then, if the mother is dead, or the mother is, I don't know, incapable or so, it then goes on to the other female members of the family. Custody of the children always first goes through the mother and her side, then goes to the father and his side, but it's all women. It's not men. The men have walaya. But here, again, it's contextual, and in most Muslim countries of the world today, the best interest of the child is what guides it, and they look at Quran, Hadith, Ijma, Sunnah, Qiyas and Ijtihad. They look at all these sources, and then they contemporize it. Yeah?
Yeah, the other part.
Towards the end, you talked a lot about cohesion, about how our humanity should be, it's from our common sense of humanity where our sort of solidarity should be derived from. However, you also said that Islam is a framework. Sometimes Muslims act in contradictory ways and they have different interpretations. Cohesion is obviously important. In light of that, in light of those different interpretations, how is the Muslim community how is the Muslim community supposed to best promote cohesion within itself and also with the wider human community?
Yeah. Well, within the Islamic legal tradition, there is a concept called tahayyur, and there's another concept called talfiq. Now, I'll quickly translate it before you think, oops, what's that? Traditionally and historically, and probably one of the reasons why we've got such a whole multitude of different schools of thought in Islam, is the fact that it means to agree to disagree. The translation of tahayyur as a juristic technique in making laws, and this is historic. It's been there throughout. Is tahayyur. So when you're saying cohesion, the cohesion and coherence has to be in the basic overarching framework. In the details, different schools of thought and different jurists have actually agreed to disagree. So that's one mechanism that I think if the Islamic communities were to adopt, then this notion of coherence, it's respect for an opinion which is different to yours. Now that's a very civilized opinion to have, an approach to have. I mean, you like blue and I like red, fine, we can coexist. Yeah? And tahayyur is in Islam, that's the juristic techniques that makes it work. The second juristic technique is called talfiq. And talfiq actually in English would be patchwork. Yeah? Means patchwork. And traditionally in Islamic law, the jurists would come together and say, well, this is my point of view, this is your point of view, etc. Let's now piece together, take some of yours, and let us construct an opinion, the underlying principle of which is justice. See, because in Islam, laws are not there just for the heck of it. They are to attain justice. And if a law is not going to attain justice, then that obviously is not something that Islam would like. So I think that from within the Islamic legal tradition, there are a number of these techniques and tips, if you will. If we were to apply them, we would result in coherence among the communities because there would be self-respect and there'd be respect for the other person. So respectfully disagreeing.
Yeah.
Hi. Do you not think that this can be problematic if we were to discuss modern day feminism and the idea of fully independent women? Doesn't mahr or dowry to some extent restrict her strength in the marriage house?
No, hang on. I wasn't talking about feminism. Like I said, I think you came a little earlier. I've started later than when I started. I started off my lecture by saying I'm drawing inspiration from within the Islamic legal tradition. Okay? So this entire talk today and sharing my opinion was from an Islamic legal tradition. Number one. So the last thing that I'm saying here is to reach out and bring in features that were not Islamically available or permissible. Yeah? That's one thing. The second thing is, you said the concept of mahar made a woman restricted.
As in the house, for strength, in the house, as in just like...
On what basis?
Well, I don't know, I'm just saying that...
You just read out that question, so is it somebody else who's the author?
No. What I'm trying to say is that, given that the man basically supplies her with some economic value...
Yeah. He doesn't supply that out of charity, my dear. It comes as part of the contract. So, part of the Muslim contract of marriage is, by mutual coordination and negotiation, it is a contract. This is what you'll do, this is what I'll do. Such and such mahar, like I said, mahar is negotiated. So why should it undermine her position? If anything, it would give it strength. My husband told my son one morning, you know what? He said, Baba, why don't we do such and such to the house? And he said, careful, careful, that's the owner. So how does it undermine me? I really don't know.
Yep, go ahead.
What does the Quran say about arranged marriage?
What does the Quran say about arranged marriage?
Yeah.
Right. Now, the Quran says that we have made partners for everyone. It means, men, women. Islamic law, derived from the Quran, demands that it is the full and free consent of the parties and that the terms are mutually agreeable. So, when we talk of the word arranged marriage, unfortunately, when concepts and words get transported from one language to another language, they lose a lot of their essence, right? So, let me try and create the scenario. All over the world, in every civilization and culture, people try to look at the institution of marriage as a social institution where it's not only for the happiness of the couple, but also that everybody's pleased with it. So for instance, if you or anybody were to take a girl, introduce her to your, or a boy, to your families, and there was one of two answers, isn't it? Either she's greeted with enthusiasm, or he's greeted with enthusiasm, or they say, oh my God. Yeah? Now, in most non-Western communities, I think the oh my God actually can translate into a very robust thing of, right, okay, so you want to get married, right, so what sort of a girl, etc., or what sort of a boy? And the arranged marriage simply means providing you with the opportunity of saying, okay, of course you can go and, you can introduce somebody to us, but it's by consent. So it's not a loan, it's a social institution. I don't know why arranged, because I think every marriage is arranged. If your friend introduces you to this fantastic young woman in the bar, that's arrangement to me. That's arrangement, isn't it? But if I don't go to the bar, and the man I want to marry doesn't go to the bar, it's got to be at a friend's place. So that certainly takes on a different connotation, and the one in the bar takes on a different connotation. I really don't see the difference. Do you see what I mean? So far as the Quran is concerned, Quran is very clear. You two have got to be happy and consent freely. I'll give you the example. The first case of khul in the Muslim world took place while the Prophet ﷺ was alive. And there was this beauty apparently called Jamila. Yeah? And Jamil in Arabic means beautiful. So anyway, her name is Jamila. And after the morning prayer, when the Prophet comes out of the mosque, he finds her standing there at the crack of dawn. And she says, I'm so-and-so's wife, and I want a decision from you as a judge. And he said, what's the problem? And he says, look, I'm this beautiful woman, and I'm married to that ugly creature. I don't want to marry him. I don't want to keep marrying. I want out. Prophet said, hang about. So is he abusive? Is he violent? Does he not treat you with kindness? Does he not give you food, etc., etc.? What has he given you for the mahar? And she says, all of that's perfectly fine. He gave me a day tortured. He's very kind. He's a very fine man. I just don't like the look on his face. And the Prophet Muhammad called the husband and said, well, actually, because Islamic law of marriage puts a lot of importance on the physical relationship. So unlike certain religious traditions, in Islam, sexual relationship and satisfaction is one of the major reasons for marriage. And if that is not there in the marriage, it's a ground for divorce. Yeah? But because we are all so prudish and squeamish, we don't talk about it and we think, oh, these poor women dumped in there and these poor men. No. In Islamic law, I mean, there's very, very clear upfront conversation about the sexual aspects of a Muslim marriage. So in this marriage, he said, that's it. There's a divorce. So that's the level of importance that physical attraction and love forms part of a Muslim marriage. But if we kind of are very squeamish about it, then who do we blame?
Yeah, 2 or 3 more questions. Go on.
Okay, for things like abortion, okay, for Islam, is it pro-choice or pro-life?
In Islamic law, there is a difference between a willful taking away of life. Willful as in, yeah, I had consensual relationship, resulted in conception, and then sometimes down the line, I'm saying, do you know what? I don't think I'm having this. That's taking life too flippantly. Yeah. On the other hand, there's a woman who's dying of leukemia or any other sort of disease of that nature. And it's very obvious that it's either her life or that of the fetus. And my own understanding would be that because Islam believes in adl and justice, then at the moment, what is the underlying importance at the moment? You've got one person who's alive and struggling, the other that is just about taking off, but not really alive and a separate individual for medical reasons. Then I personally believe, or for example, if it's a rape case, what would you do? Yeah? For me, I'm very clear what Islamic law would require. Yeah.
The girl,
Yeah.
I've got a question regarding premarital sex.
Yeah.
So, like, I've heard a lot about a lot of communities where it's okay for a man to sleep around where he's not seen in a different light by the community, but the moment a girl is, well, the moment she loses her virginity, basically she's totally sidelined by the community. So what is
my take on it? My take is very simple. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. In Islamic law, in the Quran, come on, in the Quran you've got the same ethics and morality for everybody, whether it's a man or a woman. Remember, I talked about context, I talked about the difference between Islam and Muslims, and I talked about the patriarchal notions of communities and societies. And so far as the law is concerned, because I can only tell you about what Islamic law says, what Islam says. I can't tell you about the ethics and morality that different communities will internalize. Yeah? So my reading of the Quran is that all the ethics and morality that applies to a woman applies to a man, even more so to a man. For more responsibility. If he wants more, then he has to be more responsible. So this notion of sleeping around business, I think this is to do with individual morality. It's got absolutely nothing to do with religion. I don't think Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, any religious tradition makes differential notions of morality or standards of behavior for one against the other. Yes, what Islam does allow is polygamy. But that polygamy has very strict criteria. So sleeping with a woman who's not your wife and dumping her is different to actually taking obligation for a woman as your wife. Provided those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 conditions are fulfilled. Yeah?
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions, please. Go.
Do you think, you discussed earlier the patriarchal communities, do you think if the understanding in a non-Muslim community can exacerbate that problem sometimes? So say you've got a British Muslim community, those outside of that expect, and the general understanding is Muslims are quite patriarchal.
Yeah.
Do you think the non-Muslim community needs educating more to sort of help?
Well, actually, I do think that events like this, where you can openly field questions to me and I can sort of honestly engage with this, is very, very important, because a lot of the times when we don't engage as communities, then there are lots of sort of walls that don't need to be there. Because you can ask the question and I can respond honestly and sincerely. But if you're sort of in that corner and I'm in this corner and you don't know why I'm doing a certain thing and you know, so it's all these preconceptions. Because I have to tell you very honestly, because we're talking very honestly here, I think the problem is on both sides.
Yeah.
We're all what I would call self-centric. You see what I mean? I don't know if the word exists, but I've just made it up. Self-centric, meaning, you know what, I'm me and myself, what I'm doing, I'm the cat's whiskers, I'm God's gift to humanity, and you're a bit there. I think it's both ways. I think that the Muslim communities probably have a sense of superiority over them and say, oh, these loose Western, no morals, and then the Western, oh, these barbarians. Yeah, or whatever adjective. I really don't know. I made it up. I apologize. I just made up the adjectives as I've gone along. But you see, isn't that how exactly we sort of operate? You know, you have this idea and notion about a certain person, and I think one of the problems is that if we speak respectfully to each other about our religions, about our traditions, about our beliefs, that's fine. You know, and I think that a lot of the issues arise because we do not share. We don't share. It's breaking down that barrier. I tell you, my Islamic law lectures like this every Monday, and most of them are non-Muslim. And they walk away saying, oh my God, I didn't know this about Islam. Yeah, so it's this engagement that's very important.
And are there any particular things you feel need to be done for that, or is it literally just sitting down having conversations?
I think there are 2 levels that I look at. The first level is kind of intra-community, so, you know, people talking amongst themselves and identifying what the issues are within their cultures and vis-a-vis the other culture, and likewise then talking amongst each other. So I think it's both, because even within the Muslim communities, or even within the sort of Western or whatever, I don't know, community you might want to call it, because we're all Western as well, so I think we've lost count of words now, I don't know what to call it. But I think that's important. So it's at 2 levels. It's at the level of within the communities, and it's at the level of across communities. It has to take place. And I'll tell you, and I think I probably am taking too much time, but I'll give you the example of how far away, in a tragic sense, we've come. I told you about the small mountain village that I was born in, and one of my great uncles somehow managed to come to England. Yeah, like this was God knows when. And after 6 months, when he went back, you know, everybody was excited. You know, they thought, I don't know, he'd grown horns or a tail or what, because they used to call it Velayat. Velayat is what we used to call in my language, we used to call England. And I was about a tiny tot like that, and of course I tagged along with my grandparents, because it was my grandmother's brother who'd actually been to England. A magic one. So we go there, and imagine, I'm only 5 and it's stuck in my head, and I keep saying this to everyone. And so he was talking about England, and everybody was saying, so what do people do in England, and how is life, and everything? And he said, you've got to remember 2 things about England. I thought, oh, everybody was like, oh yes, okay, so what's the first thing? In England, if you want a cup of tea, they call it kapati. Because, you know, remember, I mean, in this very sort of slang way, you say, can I have a cup? can I have a cup of tea? Don't you dare say, I want a cup. No, you have to say, I want a cup of tea. So that's the first thing he learned in England. And the second thing he learned in England, he said, do you know what? If only they would read the kalma. You know, the kalma is invoking Allah, and that is the statement that a Muslim makes to enter Islam. He said, if only the British would say the kalma, they'd be better Muslims than you and me. This is, I don't know, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. See, that was the common, so there were common humanities that my granduncle, who couldn't, he couldn't sign to save his life. You know, he was a man of the world, but he couldn't understand English if he stumbled on it, and yet he recognized the common humanity, the common values that were there. But today, if I stand up and say this, I think there'll be a lot of skepticism on both sides, because the non-Muslims will say, what? Yeah? And the Muslims will say, what? Because we've grown so apart in terms of, for no real reason. Because this was this man from the mountains who came and saw the common humanity. But where's that gone? And why has it gone away? It's gone away because we're not talking. Because he'd just sit there and he'd sort of talk to people, and I bet he didn't understand a single word. But he came away saying, oh, you know what, and they don't tell lies, and they this and that. And you know, when I grew up, I used to say, did he really know what he was talking about? But of course, love and affection and humanity, this is need to have a common language even.
One last question, please.
Oh, two?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned it actually a few times, how we can use basically a rational faculty to try to contextualize some of these verses which are apparently discriminatory.
Yeah.
Of course, from the point of view of classical Islamic law, that would just add yet another opinion to a series of already coexisting opinions, all of which are kind of considered equally valid to an extent.
Yes.
How do you square that with the sort of more rational ethics, modern point of view of universal human rights, genre roles, etc., where you kind of see ethics as converging towards something which is getting better and better.
Yeah.
So there is an apparent tension there. Do you think it's possible to harmonize that?
Well, actually, I don't see the contemporary move towards ethics and ethical convergence on the better and the just as being antithetical to the Islamic notions of justice. And I think, yes, it's one of the problems that actually historically emerged with colonization, post-colonization, with the fact that there were so many arbitrary dictatorial regimes in Islamic countries who actually stopped the rational thinking of the jurists and of the people. So for me, I think that I don't find a lot of, when I'm saying a lot of, because I think there are tensions, but I don't think that if we start from a position of the glass is half full, rather than saying the glass is half empty, if we say, right, let's get on the table, these are the commonalities. Now, where are the differences? Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, these are the differences. How do we square these? How do we engage with this? So, for example, I'll give you the most stickiest one. Yeah? Like I'm saying, got to be honest about it. The notion of apostasy. Okay? Freedom of religion, apostasy. One of the most sticking points in Islamic human rights and international human rights. Now, go back to the Quran. And the Quran says, there is no compulsion in religion. This is a verse of the Quran. Yeah? And it says, to you your religion, to me mine. Yeah? And then, I could go on and give you a stream of Quranic verses that very clearly talk about and respect freedom of religion. At the same time, within the Quran, this is apostasy actually. Murtad is basically a political concept. And it flies in the face of a number of Islamic injunctions. So for example, Muslims say there's no intermediary between them and Allah. Okay, we've got no organized clergy between you and Allah. It's all got to do with what you feel here, which you don't wear it on your sleeve. So religion then is something which is very personal, and it is personal between you and Allah. Nobody, a third person, can't come and say, you know what, you're 2 millimeters Muslim and I'm 10 millimeters Muslim. No, because what's inside you, because Allah says everything that I give is through your conscience and what I see through your actions. So I think that this debate needs to be taken further. On what basis do we deny certain people freedom of religion? So it's the sticking points that we can take forward, we can talk about. And I think there's a lot of space from within Islamic law that this can be achieved.
Thank you very much. I also have one question.
Oh, have you? Right.
As you talked about the women's rights in Islam, and you also mentioned they also have duties. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit on that?
On the duties?
Yeah, on the duties.
Oh, it's everybody's duties, not only women's duties. No, basically when I said that there's rights and there's duties, what I was trying to actually refer to was the fact that sometimes in the human rights, in the universality of human rights, we forget the duty. We normally do. We just sort of think, oh, right is I, me and myself, I, me and myself. This is my right, this is my right. But in the Islamic legal tradition, the emphasis is on right and duties. So my right has got to be your duty and your right has got to be my duty. But also when I meant for women and for men, it's in terms of being good human beings, fulfilling the roles that we all take on of our own volition. But then I have to say that Islam, although it appears that it's very, very collective and it's very claustrophobic for the individual, I think there's a lot of very, very individualistic streaks in Islam. So for example, if a woman wishes to breastfeed her child, nobody can actually force her to do that. And if there's a separation between the husband and wife, or there's a divorce, and the mother is actually looking after the child and breastfeeding, the husband has to actually pay a quantifiable sum of money to the wife. So actually the patriarchy is working both ways. So if she takes this up as a role, as a duty, then she's compensated.
Thank you very much. I think we'd all agree it's been a very, very interesting and inspiring
Thank you.
talk.